this brief talk will will live up to all of those accolades. I also want to point out, having met a number of you as we gathered here, that there are a number of people in this audience who are real experts in the subject of sustainability and green buildings and environmental issues. And so for some of you, my talk is going to seem very, very general because you live in this world every day in the work that you do. And I'll talk for a few minutes, leave some time for questions and discussion. But I just wanted to prepare you all that some of the answers may best come from people in the audience here, including my HOK colleagues, several of whom are here today. So it's not only an interested group we have here today, but an interesting group in terms of your backgrounds and in some cases your expertise in this area. I thought that environmental sustainability would be a good topic for this afternoon for several reasons. For one thing, it's urgent. We are all faced, no matter what our professions or our nationalities or our business lives are, we're all faced with a set of common challenges that are going to affect us, the world that we live in, and perhaps most poignantly, they're going to affect our children and grandchildren and future generations sharing this planet. And as I think most of you would agree, if we don't do some things differently, if we don't start some patterns of change in the world we live in today, life may not be so good for our children and grandchildren and for the future generations that we're responsible for. So it's urgent. Secondly, it is a global challenge that transcends cultures, and it transcends political boundaries of every kind. So thinking of the Niagara Foundation and your mission of bringing together people from diverse backgrounds and nationalities to address common issues, frankly, I can't think of an issue that's more pervasive than the environment is and than sustainability is for all of us, no matter where we come from or what we do. And third, this is something that fundamentally we can all do something about as individuals or as the organizations we represent. We can all do something to start something good or make progress in the area of sustainability. And I'll try to touch on what a few of those things are. But again, many of you are already doing it in the work you do. I will say that at HOK, sustainability and sustainable design has been a very high priority, a very big part of our agenda, actually since the mid-1990s. And sometimes people ask how that got started, and my answer is always that it just bubbled up all over the firm. We have about 1,800 people at HOK. We have 25 office locations currently, and are the largest architectural and engineering firm around. So at least among firms of our kind, we humbly say that we touch more people and places on the planet than anybody else. And we feel that gives us a special responsibility to do the right thing environmentally and in terms of the way our work affects human lives at every level. So in the 1990s, people at HOK in a number of different places, and I should say younger people, younger than I in many cases, identified sustainability and sustainable design as something that was going to be very, very important, something that we could make a substantial difference in, and frankly, a cause that we should support in every way we knew how. And from a leadership level, what we did was simply support all of those people in their interest, and we continue to do that today. It's a very sustainable design is a very broad endeavor at HOK today. We like to say that it affects the way we do every single thing. Rather than being an accessory to the way we normally do our business. So that's our goal, and that's how we got into this. But it's very important to our firm. It might help at the beginning to talk about what sustainability is. And of course, there are lots of definitions, lots of good ones actually. But this is my favorite because it's not just about buildings or the physical environment, it's about a whole range of things. In my view, sustainability in the broadest sense is doing things now, living our lives now so that we're meeting our needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs in their own way. And I think, as we'll talk about a little bit here, we are not living sustainably now in most parts of the world, certainly not in the U.S. So it's going to take some real work to get to a balance point that honors this definition. But this is my favorite way of talking about what sustainability really is. There are a number of dimensions to sustainability. Obviously, the thing that we hear most about and we talk most about tends to be the physical environment, tends to be climate, greenhouse gases and climate change and energy. As it's closely linked to those issues, but it also is about some other things, and we shouldn't forget what a broad topic this is. While our current patterns of energy consumption and resources are fueling climate change, pardon the pun, we need to be looking at not only changing the current patterns, but looking at how future energy needs, which will exist, are going to be met with renewable sources. So that's a bit of a different question than talking about the environmental threats that we face right now and what we can do remedially to fix them. Water is a huge issue in many parts of the world. Today, one statistic I heard was that of the world's current population of just under 7 billion people, there are over 1.5 billion people who lack fresh, clean water. Just an amazing statistic for those of us who take it for granted, certainly sitting where we're sitting in Chicago especially. 1.5 billion people out of the 7 who don't have this basic resource that's so essential to life. Food is an enormous issue, and we've been very fortunate to do some work with developing laboratories with institutions that are working on plant science, for example, trying to help emerging nations figure out how to develop and develop agricultural industries around plant species that can thrive without irrigation and without a lot of the artificial means that we know in agriculture in this country, but feeding people as the population of the world grows from 7 billion people to, and there are many forecasts, so you can pick your own number, 9, 10, 12, feeding all of our co-inhabitants on this planet is going to be a challenge. And of course, shelter is a huge concern, and for those of us who are architects, in a way, it's the most fundamental thing. Putting roofs over people's heads and keeping the rain out, something that architects have been challenged to do for thousands of years. Some have done it successfully, some not. But shelter is again just a fundamental human need, and as another statistic like that, there are 1 billion people, more or less, in the world today who lack basic housing, the essentials of it. And it's something that we should all be concerned about. So the point is that sustainability has many dimensions. It's not just about energy and climate change, although those are a very, very big part of it. So I'll talk about the different dimensions just for a few minutes, starting with climate change and global warming and the things that we can do to affect it. I like to think that today, if there's a controversy about global warming, it's a controversy not about whether it's happening, but about what we should be doing about it. Occasionally, one hears one reads a quote or one hears somebody on the radio or TV who's still a denier, who claims that that global warming is a hoax, a political move or trick of some kind. And thankfully, people with those views are becoming fewer and fewer and becoming discredited for a variety of reasons. So I think today the issue isn't an argument over whether the climate is warming in ways that are going to be very threatening, but what we should do about it. And of course, the root cause of climate change as we know it is the increase in greenhouse gases that trap heat close to the Earth's surface. That's basically what's happening, and carbon is the culprit in this. We are emitting carbon at a rapid rate into our atmosphere, building this layer of greenhouse gases which basically trap the sun's heat as it arrives on Earth and prevents that heat from being re-radiated out into space. That's sort of the short version. And I think we've proven to ourselves that this is more than a natural cycle. You all, many of you have seen the statistics, I'm sure, and heard them. The levels of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere are at an unprecedented level right now, and they're rising at an unprecedented rate. So even if you look back through thousands of years, millions of years at the ups and downs of carbon in the atmosphere, something very different is happening today, and we are, we're contributing to it. As we all know, the warming of the Earth has all sorts of negative effects, even in temperate places. Dramatic swings in weather are occurring, and we can see those now with the increased intensity of hurricanes and the density of storms and so on. So there are weather ramifications of this right now, but one of the most dramatic results, of course, is the melting of the polar ice caps, the rising of water levels, sea levels all around the world. It's a little hard to see this slide, but this is an illustration of Manhattan as it would exist if water levels rise, sea levels rise in the way that has been predicted within the next 100 years or so. Will it be this bad? We don't know. Will we see what's coming and be able to take some steps to keep the water out of Manhattan? I suspect if we saw it coming, we would. Engineers would be put to work, and there'd be funding from all over the place to try to keep it out. But the point is that life as we know it and geography as we know it would change quite a bit. Again, carbon is the culprit. Carbon dioxide, of course, comes from the burning of fossil fuels. Coal is probably the largest single, I think it is, the largest single contributor to this. Oil, as used to power all sorts of things, but most notably our vehicles, is the second major contributor to this. So carbon that has been stored away deep in the earth for millions of years, but is being excavated and burned as coal, or being pumped out and refined as oil. That carbon, which has been safely buried for all these millions of years, is now being thrown up into the atmosphere, creating the greenhouse gas layer that we're talking about. The energy that we are producing and consuming doesn't happen because somebody just wants to produce it. It happens because we are using it. We're demanding it. And that gets to the point, it's not a supply issue, it's a demand issue. And that gets to the point of the fact that we're living large here, particularly in the U.S. We're consuming resources faster than the Earth can support. We here in the U.S. are consuming far more than our share of the Earth's resources based on population. We all know this to be true, and therefore I think we in the U.S. and we in developed countries all over the world bear a particular responsibility to lead change here, and it's very difficult when you're living large and you take your energy sources for granted, and it's fairly cheap. It's very difficult to make changes. You don't feel the crisis necessarily. The people who are feeling the crisis may not be here. They may be in Bangladesh. They may be in places where the environmental ramifications of our consumption and our energy appetite are unfortunately being played out more than they are here in our own homes. The World Wildlife Federation, I think, produced this graphic projecting that that if our appetite for energy and for natural resources continues to grow at the current rate, by 2050, we'll basically need the resources of two Earths to meet the needs that exist on our one Earth. And so the contrast, the situation that we're creating for ourselves is a very dramatic one, and there are lots of different ways to look at it. The built environment is responsible, at least indirectly, for an awful lot of the patterns that we're talking about. Ultimately, the demands for energy and water and other resources come from people. A building standing empty by itself doesn't demand very much, but obviously we as planners and architects and engineers create those places to meet human needs of all kinds, and those human needs, housed the way we have housed them in our buildings, create these kinds of huge demands for energy and water. There are also other issues like landfills, what happens to waste. Great percentage of waste that ends up in our landfills comes from construction activity, demolition of buildings, construction waste, and so on. This is big impact. And in very round numbers, if you look at all of our energy demand in the U.S. and in other developed countries, about half of our total energy demand comes from buildings or from the built environment. That's a lot. About 25% of it comes from vehicles. So our cars and trucks and planes and trains and other forms of transportation account for about a fourth of the energy demand, and the other fourth is associated with industrial processes of various kinds. So it basically is a very simple breakdown, but we as planners and architects feel fairly directly responsible for about half of all of the demands that we're talking about here, and feel therefore a special responsibility for affecting it. Unfortunately, our patterns of consumption in the United States and in developed countries are being replicated or being emulated in new parts of the world. I think this is a photo of Beijing, and we all know the pace at which Beijing, or the pace at which China and India and a number of other developing countries are adding cars and trucks to their highways, are adding coal-fired power plants at an incredible rate just because of the economic growth that's occurring, the demand for energy that's there. And we're in a tough spot here in the U.S. because as we preach now, or consult, or design about sustainability and sustainable buildings, we're sort of saying, do as we say, but not as we do. We know that if emerging civilizations, emerging economies like China and India and other very populous places of the world, we know that if they do as we have done in the U.S., the consequences are going to be very dire. This is not going to be a short-term, okay. One of those Mac PC things, I think. What would show up there, don't worry about it, is that we are going to continue to need fossil fuels for a very long time. If you look at the most objective projections of how fuel sources are going to change through the years, we're going to be using a lot of coal and a lot of oil for the next 50 years, just because we can't make a big enough difference with the renewable energy sources that we know today. And so we're going to have to find better ways of using coal and better ways of using oil than we have currently. And we at HOK are actually working with some rather major energy companies to help them figure out how to do that, as well as developing alternative energy resources themselves. I saw a statistic very early this morning that is important to mention here. There's also a hidden cost to our use of coal and oil and fossil fuels. We know the environmental cost, the physical environmental cost, but there was a Harvard study released yesterday that indicated that our use of coal in the U.S. has a hidden cost, if you will, of almost $350 billion a year in terms of the health effects of coal and the environmental change on our people, and the costs of cleaning things up. And so our energy is cheap, even with gas at $3 or $4 a gallon. Our coal is very cheap, but the real cost of living large, the way we're living, is much higher, and it's harder to understand. This reminded me that in 2009, as the recession was deepening, Thomas Friedman wrote an article that I thought put some of this in very good perspective. He basically said that we have been living beyond our means, and he was talking about the U.S., but a good deal of developed civilization. We've been living beyond our means economically. Certainly we saw that with the credit issues that were coming to a head at that time, but also in terms of energy consumption. And I would add a third thing to his list, and that is we've been living beyond our means in terms of the development patterns of our cities and our physical infrastructure. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Fortunately, we seem to be at a tipping point in terms of many of the things we're talking about, at which many small efforts are coming, many small, some large efforts are coming together to change the public mind. I'm sure many of you have read Gladwell's book, the Tipping Point, but the public consciousness about environmental change and sustainability seems to have gotten to a point where something new is happening. There's a new energy around it that's very important. It also reminds us, I'm sure many of you have heard this, the Chinese characters that express our word crisis are really two characters, one of which represents danger and the other of which represents opportunity. Now, I've heard some people argue about whether that's literally true with these two characters. I am not an expert, so I can't even have the argument. But the point is that in the present crisis, there is obviously danger, there are obviously threats, but there's a huge opportunity for those of us who can figure out how to make a difference. One of the ways that we can see the tipping point is that major businesses, a couple of us were talking about Caterpillar a few minutes ago, major businesses have adopted serious agendas for sustainability in their own operations and for products that can take us to a new place from an energy and environmental standpoint. Even Walmart, in its looking at its own facilities, its attempts to deal with more efficient packaging, its focus on compact fluorescent light bulbs and so on. We all have to recognize Walmart can make a huge difference in terms of what it offers and the buying patterns of American consumers, whether we all like it or not. The media have certainly picked up on this. Again, the reality of global warming isn't being debated so much anymore, but the action is, what do we now do about it? So what I'd like to tell you about in the next very few minutes is just what we're doing to address this as architects and planners, and I'm going to take it from the very general to the to the more specific. And at the broadest scale, we're very fortunate to be involved, and some people from HOK in the room here are involved in planning very significant new communities or redevelopment of existing cities on a very large scale. And this is important because, as you all know, now, as of a year or two ago, more than 50% of the world's population lives in cities. And one dramatic illustration of this, you can look at China, India, you can look at Pakistan, certainly. But one interesting statistic is that India, just based on its pace of population growth and urbanization, will need the equivalent of one new Chicago every year for the next 25 or 30 years. And of course, that won't all occur in one place, but it's the impact of this urbanization and population growth is pretty amazing. So what we're trying to do is help public and private clients think about more dense, planned communities, often centered around public transportation. They're more walkable, more bikeable, much less dependent on private vehicles than we are here. And these sorts of things have shown that we can reduce energy consumption, water consumption, and carbon emissions by 50% with correctly planned communities relative to what we know in the way our cities tend to have grown and sprawled, frankly, in the U.S. and in North America. This is an example called Langfang. It's something done in our Hong Kong office for southeastern China. This is a project in Atlanta called the Green Line. It's basically redeveloping an urban core around public transit in Atlanta so that there's a much more sustainable, much more livable community there. This is something we're doing in suburban Washington, D.C., in northern Virginia. Even in traditional suburbs like that, the opportunity to create more livable communities, more walkable communities is recognized. Another thing that we're doing is finding ways to emulate the efficiency and the marvelous processes that are at work in nature. And we at HOK put together an alliance a couple of years ago with a group called the Biomimicry Guild. You might know a book entitled Biomimicry by a woman named Janine Benyus, who heads the guild. And she and her colleagues, some of whom are in this photo, are working with us to bring very basic lessons from nature to bear on the work we're doing. And it's just fascinating. These are photographs of an area that we have master planned and are developing in near Pune in India, on the southwestern edge of India. And this is a reservoir which supplies drinking water for the city of Pune. On the lower right, you see that reservoir after monsoon season when it's fairly full. And as the dry season occurs, it goes away. The water gets consumed, so you have the image on the lower left. And so what we're doing is using biomimetic principles to see how we can capture for buildings, for the communities that are being developed around this reservoir, how we can capture water much in the way nature does, storing it in our equivalent of root systems that feed these new buildings and communities. Very interesting. Fundamentally, and this is another photo of that new community. It's just a marvelous place. Fundamentally, the other thing we're doing is creating better buildings, which are more sustainable, and there are a number of ways we can do that. The first thing I want to say is that if we can avoid building a new building, what could be more environmentally effective than that? So there's a huge opportunity to make good use of buildings that already exist, to renew, to restore, rather than replace. And we're involved with a number of examples of that. One, it might seem trivial, but one example is the Camden Yard ballpark in Baltimore that our sport group did a number of years ago. And of course, it used an existing warehouse and some other historic structures to create something that was not all brand new in steel and concrete, but was sort of the fabric of that existing city. We're also working with the GSA, General Services Administration, on the renovation of this federal office building in Denver called the Byron Rogers Building. It is our federal government's one of our federal government's demonstration projects about how this can be done, how an existing building can be made to be more efficient and more effective. Other building elements, I won't belabor all of these, but other building design elements that play into this are natural light and ventilation. Natural light, or artificial light, excuse me, in a building like this one accounts for a huge percentage of the cooling costs associated with the structure. So the cost of air conditioning, the building we're in, comes partly from us as people, but a huge percentage of that air conditioning cost comes from the fact that the lights are adding heat to the space. So natural light is a very big deal. Ventilation is. We're using local materials, healthier materials. In this example, for a transportation agency in California, actually doing a straw bale building that creates this low-rise building with walls built around organic materials like that. We're doing things to conserve water, cisterns and collection systems that on sites that actually clean water that runs off from buildings and parking lots, either stores it for future use in sanitary fixtures and all that sort of thing, or cleans that water, if it's stormwater, cleans that water so that it's better when it leaves the site than it was when it came on. And we're looking, of course, at renewable energy sources. This is a little laboratory building in San Mateo, California. We call it the little building that could, because laboratories by nature demand an awful lot of energy, and this building with its solar arrays on the roof much of the time supplies all of its own power and sends a little bit back into the local grid at the same time. Another thing we're doing is affecting public policies and practices in major agencies. We're working and have been working with the District of Columbia to develop their policies for sustainable planning and design and building certification. This is work that HOK did with public officials there. I'm proud to say we're working with the Chicago Housing Authority on an environmental assessment of many of the CHA's properties. And I was reminded this morning this involves 50 sites, almost 600 buildings, and they are actively pursuing existing building certification through the LEED program for many of those. So we can influence the way our public agencies function as well. Putting it all together in a couple of recent things that we've done include this very large university in the west side of Saudi Arabia. It's called King Abdullah University for Science and Technology. Huge development, finished in 3 years. This is the world's largest LEED Platinum certified complex of buildings. In fact, humbly we would say that all of the other LEED Platinum buildings in the world would easily fit inside it. So this can be done at a small scale or a very large one. This is a prototype building we designed recently as a zero emissions building. It's meant to be an example of how a commercial office building can actually be developed competitively without emitting any net carbon emissions at all. And it has, by our calculation, about a 12-year payback to make all that work. And it can be a very nice place at the same time. It doesn't look strange. It's very accommodating. And we're also working with several clients, commercial real estate companies, on what we call occupancy engagement, occupant engagement programs, so that the people who inhabit the buildings can actually develop new personal habits around recycling, around the use of energy, turning things off that they don't need, because again, it's not buildings per se that use energy, it's the people who inhabit them. So in sum, what do we do now? I think every one of us can practice reduction in our own use of resources of whatever kind, water, energy. We can all think of ways we can do that. There's a lot of research that we need to support around renewable energy and water efficiency and even agriculture, as I mentioned at the beginning. We're focused on renewing rather than replacing things. And we're certainly doing that with buildings. Maybe it could be done with cars and buses and other things. Reporting is a significant need because we need to measure. And we in the design and construction industry are very aware of this. We need to measure the real performance of the buildings and the cities we're creating in a way that we have not done. All of this talk about LEED certification, for example, is somewhat theoretical. We count points and we think we're doing the right thing, but the proof has not usually been demonstrated in the way we'd like it to be done. And finally, retraining ourselves and future generations, not only to have the kind of awareness that we need of environmental sustainability, but to develop the kinds of personal habits and corporate habits that are going to change life for future generations. So that's what I had to say. It took me a little longer to say it than I thought it might. This was a great program today. I was honored to be asked to speak to the Niagara Foundation Luncheon Forum and really imagine the quality of the other programs that you have. It's just terrific. The diversity of people here and the different nationalities and business and institutional perspectives that you have are terrific. So I appreciate what you're doing.